They didn't bother lowering their voices. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Not the insult itself, but how casually he said it, like I wasn't even in the room to hear it. Put away that antique badge. It's not going to buy you any sympathy in this room. 300 people heard him say it. My own son-in-law sat 2 tables over, smiling like a man who'd already spent the money in his head. My daughter sat somewhere behind me, close enough to hear every word, too far to reach for my hand. And the man behind the bench, the one with the gavel, the one who was supposed to be neutral, had just decided, out loud, in front of everyone, that I was an old fool who didn't deserve to finish his sentence. I'd spent months being talked over at my own dinner table, months watching a fake report turn into a lawsuit, watching a lawsuit turn into a hearing, watching everyone in my life decide, one polite conversation at a time, that the easiest thing to do with an old man who wouldn't sell was to simply stop listening to him. I sat there that morning with nothing but a worn briefcase and a pin on my jacket. Everyone in that room had already decided meant nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just reached down and unfastened the 2 brass clasps. That's when the doors at the back of the chamber opened. Every face in that chamber went still at once. The councilman's hand freezing over his gavel, my own daughter's breath catching somewhere behind me. My son-in-law was the only one who moved. He shot up out of his chair so fast it nearly toppled behind him, the color draining out of his face in an instant. Like a man watching a victory he'd already started celebrating get yanked out of his hands before he'd even finished the sentence. Somewhere behind me another chair scraped back. Nobody in that room was expecting who walked through them. I'll tell you exactly how I got to that moment, and exactly who was standing in that doorway. But first you need to understand how a quiet old man ends up on trial for the one thing he had left in the world. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was about to regret it, hit subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read everyone. Now let's go back to where this actually started. The first thing you should know about me is that I have never once raised my voice to prove a point. 46 years in structural engineering taught me that. The buildings that stand the longest are never the ones that shout the loudest about their own strength. They're the ones with the deepest foundations, poured quietly, checked twice, and never spoken of again until the day someone tries to knock them down. My name is Warren Ashcroft. I'm 72 years old, and for most of my working life, I was the man cities called when something needed to survive another 100 years. Courthouses, bridges. Once a cathedral bell tower that everyone said couldn't be saved. I saved it anyway. I never put my name on a plaque. I never gave interviews. My late wife used to tease me that I'd rather disappear into a blueprint than stand in a photograph. And she wasn't wrong. On the morning this story really begins, I was in my workshop behind the house, sanding down the arm of an old oak chair that had belonged to my grandfather. The joint had loosened over the decades, the way joints do, and I was working it slow, feeling for the exact place where the wood wanted to give and the exact place where it wanted to hold. That's the whole trick of my trade, if you want to know the truth of it. You don't force a structure to be strong. You listen to where the strength already is, and you protect it. I remember thinking, with the morning light coming through the workshop window and sawdust drifting in it like something suspended in time, that I believed the same thing about buildings as I believed about people. What's most solid never announces itself. It sits quietly underground, in the foundation, where no one thinks to look until the day everything above it is tested. I had no idea how soon that day was coming. To understand what happened to me, you need to understand Oakwood first, because Oakwood was never just a building. It was the last living piece of my late wife, Constance, and if you'd known her, you'd understand why losing it would have felt like losing her twice. Constance and I bought that lot 40 years ago, when it was nothing but a collapsed feed store and a lot of weeds. She had this idea, back when nobody else in town took it seriously, that the neighborhood needed a place where kids who couldn't afford tutoring or books or a quiet room to do their homework in could come and simply be children who were allowed to learn. I built the bones of it with my own hands on weekends, after my paying jobs were done. She filled it with donated books, second-hand desks, and 30 years of her own unpaid time teaching reading to children whose parents worked 2 and 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. By the time she passed, 6 years ago now, Oakwood Community Library wasn't a building anymore. It was a promise she'd kept for 3 decades, and one I intended to keep for the rest of my life, however long that turned out to be. The building belonged to the 2 of us on paper, myself and our daughter Nora, split evenly the way Constance had wanted it, so that the decision of what became of it could never rest in just one set of hands. That was supposed to be a safeguard. I never imagined it would become the very seam someone would try to pull apart. Nora married Bryce Callahan 9 years ago, and for the first several of those years I told myself the things people tell themselves when they want peace at the dinner table more than they want honesty. Bryce was ambitious, I told myself. Bryce liked numbers, liked deals, liked closing things. There was nothing wrong with a man who understood the value of property, I said, even as I watched him look at our home, at Constance's photographs on the mantel, at Oakwood itself, the way another man might look at a spreadsheet waiting to be balanced. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment over Thanksgiving about how much the old library must be costing us in upkeep. A magazine article he left conspicuously on my kitchen table about the revitalization potential of aging civic buildings. Then it stopped being small. Bryce began arriving at family dinners with numbers already prepared, projections, comparisons, a folder of glossy renderings showing luxury apartments where Oakwood's reading room currently stood. He had an answer ready for every objection before I could even finish raising it. The building was outdated, he said. The maintenance costs would only climb. And here was his generous solution, delivered with the practiced warmth of a man closing a sale. Sell the lot, and he would personally see to it that a portion of the proceeds funded a scholarship in Constance's name. He said her name so easily, so smoothly, that it took everything in me not to flinch every time he did. I refused, not angrily, not the first few times. I simply said no, and explained patiently that Oakwood wasn't a line item to be liquidated. It was 30 years of a woman's life, still doing exactly what she built it to do. Children still walked through those doors after school. The reading circle Constance had started in 1996 was still meeting on Tuesday afternoons, now taught by volunteers who had once been students there themselves. Bryce didn't accept no easily. He never has. Each family dinner grew a little more strained than the last. He'd bring up the topic again, wrapped in different language, softer language, concerned language, always angled toward my age, my energy, whether I could really keep managing a building like that at 72. And I began to notice something that troubled me far more than his persistence. Nora, my daughter, who had grown up in that library, who had learned to read at one of those second-hand desks herself, started going quiet during these conversations. She used to argue Oakwood's case as fiercely as I did. Now she mostly looked down at her plate. I understood slowly and painfully what was happening to her. Bryce didn't shout to get his way. He wore people down the way water wears down stone, a soft, patient erosion delivered over years, until the person being worn away starts mistaking exhaustion for agreement. I watched my own daughter's certainty erode a little more at every dinner, and there was nothing I could do to stop the tide except keep saying no and hope she remembered, somewhere underneath the fatigue, why the answer mattered. Then came the Tuesday. It was gray out, the kind of low, flat sky Constance used to call library weather, because she said it made people want to come inside and read. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee when I heard the knock, sharp and official, the kind of knock that doesn't belong to a neighbor or a delivery driver. A man in a windbreaker stood on my porch holding a manila envelope, and he handed it to me without quite meeting my eyes, the particular courtesy of someone who has delivered enough bad news to know better than to look a person in the face while doing it. Inside was a summons. The city planning committee was ordering me to appear at a formal hearing. Attached to it, typed in the flat, bureaucratic language that tries so hard to sound neutral while doing something anything but neutral, was a petition filed by Bryce Callahan requesting the emergency suspension of my ownership rights over the property at Oakwood on the grounds that the structure failed to meet current structural safety standards. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading it, the coffee going cold in front of me, my hand steady even though nothing else in me was. I had personally inspected every load-bearing wall in that building myself, more times than I could count, over more than 3 decades. I knew, with the same certainty I'd known about bridges and bell towers, that there was nothing structurally wrong with Oakwood, which meant only one thing. Whatever report Bryce had used to justify that petition had not come from an honest inspection. It had come from somewhere else entirely, and somebody, somewhere, had signed their name to a lie in order to help my son-in-law take the last piece of my wife away from me. I set the envelope down on the table, and for the first time since I'd opened it, I allowed myself to feel something close to anger. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that settles into your foundation and doesn't move again until the day it's tested. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. Then I went out to the workshop, put down the sanding cloth, and looked for a long while at the chair I hadn't finished. Some repairs I thought would have to wait. I had a hearing to prepare for, and for the first time in my career, the structure I needed to defend wasn't made of steel or stone. It was everything Constance had spent her life building, and I was not going to let it fall. The morning of the hearing, I put on the same navy suit I'd worn to Constance's funeral. It was old, the fabric gone slightly shiny at the elbows, but I'd had it pressed the night before until the creases sat sharp as a drafting line. Pinned to the left lapel was a small medallion, a hammer crossed over a compass, cast in gold-plated bronze, worn soft at the edges from decades spent in my jacket pocket before I ever thought to wear it openly. It was the Presidential Award for Historic Preservation, given to me 11 years earlier for the bell tower restoration everyone in 3 counties had said couldn't be done. I hadn't worn it publicly more than a handful of times in over a decade. But that morning, standing in front of the mirror in the same house Constance and I had raised Nora in, some old instinct told me to pin it on anyway, and I've learned at 72 not to argue with an instinct that has kept me right for this long. I looked at myself for a moment longer than usual before I left, an old man in a pressed suit, about to walk into a room built to make him small, and I decided quietly that I would not let it. City Hall's main chamber was packed by the time I arrived. More people crowded into those rows than I'd ever seen at a planning hearing in my life. Folding chairs dragged in along the back wall to hold the overflow, the low murmur of a room that smelled faintly of old varnish and fresh coffee. Word travels fast in a town this size, and apparently a fight over Oakwood was exactly the kind of drama people preferred to watching the morning pass at their desks. I recognized a few faces from the library itself, former students now grown, parents whose children still walked through Oakwood's doors every afternoon, sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers who'd only come for the spectacle. Bryce was already seated at the petitioner's table when I walked in, flanked by 2 attorneys in suits so crisp they looked engineered rather than tailored. He caught my eye as I came down the aisle and smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a cruel one, exactly, just the settled, satisfied smile of a man who believes the outcome has already been decided and is simply waiting for everyone else in the room to catch up to a conclusion he arrived at weeks ago. Nora sat 2 rows behind him in the gallery, not beside him, I noticed, and not beside me either, caught in the exact middle distance she'd been living in for months. She stared straight ahead at the empty bench, her hands knotted together so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale, and for a moment our eyes met, and she looked away first. At the front of the chamber, behind an elevated bench that put him a full head above everyone in the room, sat Councilman Everett Doyle, chairman of the City Planning Committee. I'd heard of him before that morning, the way you hear about certain kinds of weather, second-hand and cautionary, from other homeowners who'd stood in front of him and come away rattled. He had a reputation for running his hearings less like public proceedings and more like a courtroom he owned outright, for treating dissent as a personal inconvenience, for making an example out of anyone slow enough or stubborn enough to hold up his schedule. I didn't yet know that reputation from experience. Within the hour I would. He gavelled the room to order with a sharp crack that made half the gallery flinch, glanced down at the file already open in front of him, and moved through the preliminary motions with the brisk, bored efficiency of a man enduring paperwork on his way to a decision he'd made before anyone in that chamber had taken a seat. I watched him nod along, almost absently, as Bryce's lead attorney outlined the petition's claims describing Oakwood in clinical, bloodless language, as though 30 years of a woman's life could be reduced to square footage and depreciation schedules. I watched his pen tap an idle, impatient rhythm against the wood the moment it came time for my side to speak. This was not, I understood within the first 10 minutes, a hearing built to weigh evidence. This was a formality dressed up for an audience, moving toward a conclusion that had been settled somewhere else, long before the gavel ever came down. My attorney, a careful, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth Halloway, laid out my case methodically, without theatrics. I had personally inspected Oakwood's load-bearing structure on a documented schedule for over 30 years. My own engineering credentials predated Bryce's entire career by decades. The so-called safety report his petition rested on had come from a firm none of us had ever heard of, commissioned quietly, without notifying either owner of record, myself or my daughter, a procedural oversight that should have raised concern before this hearing was ever scheduled at all. I had brought with me a set of my own hand-drawn structural assessments, decades of them, annotated in my own handwriting, the same method I had used on every restoration of my career, federal projects included. I set the stack on the table in front of me, yellowed paper covered in careful pencil notations, load calculations, sketches of joists and support beams I knew as intimately as the lines on my own hands. Councilman Doyle looked down at that stack of paper, the way a man looks at something a dog has dragged in from the yard. He lifted the top page between two fingers, studied it for exactly as long as it took to arrive at his contempt, and let it drop back onto the pile. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, and I noted, distantly, that he hadn't bothered to get my name right. "This is the 21st century. A pile of outdated scraps and sentimental nostalgia isn't going to stand in the way of this city's development." His eyes drifted to my lapel, to the small gold medallion catching the fluorescent light overhead, and something in his expression sharpened into open mockery. "And you can put away the antique hardware. It's not going to buy you any sympathy in this room." The chamber went very still. Somewhere behind me, in the gallery, I heard a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, and I understood without turning that at least one person in that room recognized exactly what he had just dismissed as hardware. I want to tell you I felt anger in that moment, the hot, immediate kind that pushes a man's voice up before he can stop it. I didn't. What I felt instead was the same cold, settling calm I used to feel 40 feet up on scaffolding, checking a beam I already suspected was compromised, the instant before you confirm what you already know. Constance used to say I got quieter, not louder, the more serious a moment became. She was right. I have never once needed volume to make a point land. I didn't reach for the medallion. I didn't touch it at all. I simply folded my hands on the table in front of me, the way I do when I'm about to say something I intend to have remembered exactly as spoken, and I let my voice carry, level and unhurried, into every corner of that packed chamber. "Councilman," I said, "I'd like the record to confirm specifically which provision of municipal planning law you're citing when you instruct me to remove my presidential award for historic preservation." The silence that followed had a different weight than the one before it. I watched something shift across Councilman Doyle's face, quick and involuntary. The look of a man who has just heard his own words played back to him and realized, a half-second too late, exactly how they sounded out loud, in public, on the official record. His pen, which had been tapping its idle rhythm against the bench a moment earlier, went still. Beside him, the stenographer's fingers never stopped moving. Every word he had just said, every ounce of contempt in it, was already being pressed permanently into the transcript of that hearing, time-stamped and unerasable, the kind of thing a man in his position generally spends a whole career being careful never to say into a live microphone. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't needed to. I had asked one clean, quiet question and left it sitting in the silence for the entire room to weigh for themselves. Bryce's confident smile had thinned at the edges. Beside him, both attorneys had gone carefully blank-faced, the stillness of people recalculating in real time whether their morning was still unfolding the way they'd planned it on paper. And at the front of the chamber, Councilman Everett Doyle sat with his gavel resting untouched beside his hand, staring down at a stack of hand-drawn engineering plans he had, 30 seconds earlier, called a pile of scraps, understanding, I think, faster than most men in his position would, that he had just made a mistake he was not going to be able to talk his way back out of. For a long moment, nobody in that chamber moved. I have stood on job sites during silences like that before. The particular hush that falls over a crew the instant after someone realizes a beam has shifted under a load it was never rated to carry, and everyone in the room understands all at once that the ground beneath their feet is no longer quite what they believed it to be a second earlier. That was the silence in City Hall. You could hear the ventilation system humming somewhere above the ceiling tiles. You could hear a chair creak in the back row as someone shifted their weight, unable to sit still inside a quiet that heavy, and somewhere further back, a phone buzzed once against a wooden bench and went silent again, as though even the room's own devices understood they shouldn't interrupt. Councilman Doyle recovered faster than I expected. Men who have spent years being obeyed without question tend to develop a particular kind of reflex, a way of papering over their own missteps with a fresh show of authority before anyone has time to dwell on the crack that just appeared beneath them. He cleared his throat, straightened the file in front of him with more force than the gesture required, and looked back up at me with his jaw set. "That's not the matter before this committee," he said, his voice pitched a shade louder than it needed to be, the way a man raises his voice when he's trying to convince himself as much as the room. "Whatever medals you're wearing, Mr. Pendleton, this hearing is about whether that building meets code. I'll ask you again to set aside the theatrics and let's move forward." I understood in that moment exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. Not a man capable of admitting a mistake in front of an audience, not yet, but a man who had just felt the floor shift under him, and out of pure stubborn pride had decided to plant his feet harder rather than step back. I've seen that instinct before, in contractors who keep pouring concrete over a foundation they already suspect is cracked because stopping to admit the crack feels to them like a bigger failure than the building eventually coming down around everyone's ears. It rarely ends the way they hope it will. I didn't argue with him. I have never found much use in arguing with a man who has already decided not to listen. Instead, I reached down and unfastened the 2 brass clasps on my briefcase, the same leather case I had carried to job sites for the better part of 3 decades, its corners worn pale and soft from 1,000 desks and drafting tables, from courthouses and rooftops, and one memorable afternoon on scaffolding above a cathedral bell tower. The sound of those clasps releasing seemed to carry farther than it should have in that silent chamber, a small, deliberate click that made a few heads in the gallery turn toward me. I didn't say much as I opened it. There wasn't much left to say yet, not until the paper had spoken for itself. I lifted out a folder, dark blue, slightly worn at the corners from having been handled and rehandled over the past several weeks, while I waited to see whether I would ever actually need it, hoping, in some quiet corner of myself, that I wouldn't. Inside it sat a set of documents bearing an official federal seal stamped in red ink across the top of every page. I could have handed the folder to the clerk, the way procedure generally called for. I chose not to. I stood, buttoned my jacket out of old habit, and walked it up to the bench myself, past the petitioner's table, where Bryce sat watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before that morning, past the gallery where I could feel, without looking, my daughter's eyes following every step I took. I wanted Councilman Doyle to receive this from my own hand, not a clerk's. I wanted him to have to open it himself, in front of every single person who was watching him do it. He took the folder with visible reluctance, the practiced disinterest of a man who has reviewed 10,000 exhibits in his career and expects the 10,001st to be just as forgettable as the rest. He flipped it open. The first page was a formal certificate, dated 3 months earlier, confirming that the Oakwood Community Library had been quietly entered onto the National Register of Historic Places, its designation reviewed and personally signed by the Secretary of the Interior. I had applied for that designation over a year ago, after Constance passed, not because I had anticipated a fight like this one, but because I had wanted some permanent federal acknowledgement that what she built there mattered beyond our own family, beyond our own town, beyond anyone's ability to simply decide otherwise one day over dinner. I had told almost no one it had come through, not Nora, certainly not Bryce. I watched Councilman Doyle's eyes move across that first page, watched his hand resting against the edge of the bench go very still, the fingers no longer drumming their earlier idle rhythm. The second page was a summary of federal statute, laid out in plain, unambiguous legal language, explaining that any structure entered onto the National Register was protected from interference, demolition, or forced transfer of ownership by local government action, absent explicit authorization from Congress itself. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a courtesy extended to buildings that happened to carry some sentimental value. It was federal law, sitting on that bench in black and red ink, directly contradicting every assumption this entire hearing had been quietly built on from the start. I watched the color shift in Councilman Doyle's face, subtle at first, the particular drain of a man realizing the solid ground he'd been standing on all morning had a crack running straight through the middle of it that he simply hadn't noticed until someone handed it to him in writing. He read the second page once, then a second time, his lips moving faintly the way people's do when they've stopped simply reading and started calculating instead, running the numbers on exactly how badly he had misjudged this morning and how many people in that packed chamber had already watched him do it. Beside the petitioner's table, I watched something break loose in Bryce's expression, the confident, settled certainty he'd walked in with that morning, finally giving way to something closer to confusion, and then, a beat later, something closer to fear. His attorneys leaned toward each other whispering, one of them already reaching for his own copy of the petition as though rereading it might somehow change what it said. It wouldn't. A petition built on a fraudulent report doesn't get sturdier just because the man who filed it wishes, very badly in that moment, that it were otherwise. The room that had been humming with quiet conversation only minutes earlier had gone entirely silent now, the particular stillness a crowd falls into when they sense they're watching something shift in real time and don't want to miss a single second of it by making a sound. The only thing still moving in that chamber was the small red recording light on the court reporter's equipment and the steady, unbothered rhythm of her fingers across the keys, capturing every second of that silence along with everything that had come before it. I stood at the bench a moment longer than I strictly needed to, not out of theater, but because I wanted to be entirely certain Councilman Doyle had finished reading, that there would be no version of this morning left in which he could later claim he simply hadn't understood what was placed directly in front of him. Then I turned, walked back to my seat, and sat down beside Ruth, folding my hands on the table exactly as I had before, the same posture I'd held since the moment this hearing began. Nora in the gallery had gone very still. I didn't look at her directly, but I could feel, even from across the room, the exact instant the full weight of what she was watching settled over her, the slow, sinking realization that whatever her husband had told her about this morning, about a routine hearing, a simple procedural matter, a formality on the way to a sale, everyone would eventually be glad about once it was done. None of it had been the truth. Not one word of it. Not from the very beginning. Somewhere behind me I heard the low murmur of the gallery finally breaking its silence. Whispers passing from row to row, the way news travels through a crowd that has just watched the ground shift under people they'd assumed were untouchable. An older man near the back, someone I recognized vaguely as a former trustee of the Historical Society, was nodding slowly to himself. The particular satisfaction of a man watching a piece of paperwork he'd once helped set into motion finally do exactly what it was designed to do. I let the room have its moment. There would be more to come before the morning was finished, and I intended to let every bit of it land exactly the way it needed to. Ruth waited until the chamber had settled back into something resembling order before she rose to her feet. "Councilman," she said, addressing Doyle with a formality that suddenly sounded, given everything that had just happened, almost pointed, "we'd like to call our witness." The doors at the back of the chamber opened with a heavy, deliberate sound, the kind that makes an entire room turn in its seats before anyone even knows what they're turning to look at. I didn't need to turn myself. I already knew who was walking through them because I'd made the call 3 weeks earlier. Sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, explaining as plainly as I could that this had stopped being only about Oakwood and had become something larger than either of us had expected when this whole thing began. Dr. Vernon Halsey walked down the center aisle in a gray suit instead of the field gear I remembered him wearing the last time I'd seen him in person, 12 years earlier. Both of us standing on scaffolding 60 feet above a state capitol rotunda, arguing cheerfully about load tolerances while contractors below waited, not entirely patiently, for us to finish. He was the state's chief structural inspector now, a title that meant, in practice, that when disputes over a building's safety became serious enough, complicated enough, contested enough that ordinary municipal inspectors couldn't settle them, his was the final word the state itself trusted above every other opinion in the room. He took the stand with the unhurried, unbothered precision of a man who had testified before far more serious panels than a county planning committee handling what had been dressed up on paper as a simple property dispute. Ruth walked him through his credentials first, though most of the room, I suspect, had already begun to understand from the way he carried himself that this was not a man who needed his credentials explained to be believed. "Dr. Halsey," Ruth asked, "can you describe your professional history with Mr. Pendleton?" "I can," he said. "I've known Warren for over 30 years. We first worked together on the reinforcement design for the West Reading Room addition at the Library of Congress, back when I was a junior structural analyst. And he was already, frankly, something of a legend in restoration circles, whether he'd ever admit that about himself or not." He glanced toward me, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "He wouldn't. He never has. Not once in 30 years. A ripple moved through the gallery at that, a low murmur of surprise that told me most of the people in that chamber had walked in that morning believing exactly what Bryce's petition had wanted them to believe, that I was simply an old man clinging sentimentally to a crumbling building, a stubborn relic standing in the way of obvious progress. Dr. Halsey continued, unhurried, laying it out plainly, the way engineers describe things when the facts themselves are dramatic enough without embellishment. "My structural signature," he explained, had been used to certify reinforcement work on federal buildings across 6 states. My drawings carried in the industry a particular kind of guarantee that few working engineers ever earned in a lifetime, the kind regulatory bodies accepted without secondary review, because my name, attached to a load calculation, had never once, in over 40 years of practice, been found wrong. I sat very still while he spoke. I always do when someone else is telling that part of my story instead of me. It's easier to hear it in another man's voice than to carry the weight of saying it myself, the way it would sound, like boasting coming from my own mouth. Then Ruth asked the question this entire testimony had actually been built around. Dr. Halsey, were you asked to conduct an independent review of the structural safety report submitted as the basis for this petition? I was, he said, and something in his tone shifted. The easy warmth of a moment ago replaced by the flat, careful precision of a man about to say something he intended to be remembered exactly as spoken. At Ms. Halloway's request, my office conducted a full independent audit of the report filed by Mr. Callahan's engineering consultant 3 weeks ago. I want to be precise about what we found because the implications here are serious ones. He opened a folder of his own, thin, official, stamped with the state seal. The report claims structural deterioration in the east load-bearing wall consistent with foundation settling. Our audit found no such deterioration whatsoever. The photographs included in the original report do not match the current condition of the building. In 2 instances, they appear to have been taken at an entirely different structure altogether. The measurements cited for wall deflection were altered from the raw inspection data, which our office was able to recover directly from the firm that performed the original site visit. In plain terms, the report submitted to this committee was fabricated deliberately to manufacture a safety concern that does not exist, in order to justify the emergency suspension being requested here today. The word fabricated landed in that chamber like a dropped tool striking concrete, sharp and unmistakable, impossible to soften after the fact. I heard someone in the gallery gasp audibly. Councilman Doyle's pen, still resting motionless beside the folder I had handed him minutes earlier, didn't move at all now, and I understood he had gone somewhere past simple embarrassment and into something closer to alarm. The particular alarm of an official realizing his own committee had very nearly been used as an instrument in something considerably more serious than a family property dispute. I didn't look at Bryce during any of this. I didn't need to. I could hear it in the sudden, sharp scrape of a chair leg against the floor as one of his attorneys shifted his weight, in the low, urgent murmur passing between the two of them. Voices pitched too low for the gallery to make out the words, but unmistakable in their tone. Whatever confidence Bryce had walked into that chamber with that morning had drained out of him entirely now, replaced by the particular stillness of a man watching a plan. He'd built very carefully come apart. In front of an audience, he'd expected to simply witness his victory. It was Nora I found myself watching, though, more than any of them. She had gone rigid in her seat, her hands no longer knotted together in her lap, but pressed flat against her knees, as though she needed something solid to hold on to, while the floor beneath everything she'd believed about her own marriage quietly gave way beneath her. I watched the exact moment it landed for her, the instant her face changed from confusion into something raw and unguarded, something closer to grief than anger, though I suspect both were tangled together in whatever she was feeling in that moment. This wasn't simply a husband who had disagreed with his father-in-law about the value of an old building. This was a man who had commissioned a fraudulent report, dragged his own wife's family into a public hearing built on manufactured evidence, and had been prepared, apparently without hesitation, to let her father lose the last piece of her mother he had left, also that a well-situated lot could be cleared for something with a better quarterly return. She put a hand over her mouth. I watched her shoulders begin to shake, quietly, the kind of crying a person does when they're trying very hard not to make a scene in a public room full of strangers, and it was all I could do, sitting at that table with my back to her, not to get up and go to her right then. I didn't. I understood, somehow, that she needed this moment to belong entirely to her, the full, unfiltered weight of finally seeing clearly what she had spent months allowing herself not to see. and that whatever comfort I had to offer her would matter more once this hearing had finished than it would in the middle of it, in front of everyone. Dr. Halsey closed his folder and looked, not at Bryce, not at me, but directly at Councilman Doyle. "I'd also note," he added, his voice carrying easily into every corner of that silent chamber, "that knowingly submitting falsified inspection data to a municipal planning committee isn't simply a civil matter. It's a criminal one, under state code, and it carries penalties well beyond anything this committee is equipped to handle on its own. I'd strongly recommend this committee refer the report, and whoever commissioned it, to the appropriate authorities before proceeding any further this morning." Councilman Doyle didn't answer right away. He sat with both hands flat on the bench in front of him, staring at the folder Dr. Halsey had just closed, and I watched him glance once briefly toward the court reporter, as if only now remembering that every word of this exchange, his own included, was already being pressed permanently into a record he no longer had any way of controlling. Whatever this hearing had been designed to accomplish when Bryce filed his petition weeks earlier, it had stopped being that entirely, somewhere between the federal seal and the word fabricated, and everyone in that chamber, including the man behind the bench, understood it now. Councilman Doyle sat with his hands folded on the bench for what felt like a long time, though it was probably no more than 15 or 20 seconds, the particular stretched-out silence of a man trying to find some route back to solid ground in front of an audience that had just watched him lose his footing twice in one morning. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the sharp, dismissive confidence it had carried an hour earlier. "Given the nature of Dr. Halsey's testimony," he said, reaching for his gavel, "I think it's appropriate for this committee to call a brief recess. We'll reconvene to consider next steps once we've had time to review the matter internally." I understood exactly what that meant, and I suspect most of the room did too. A recess would give him time to make calls, to consult with counsel of his own, to find some quiet, private way to walk back this morning before it became something he couldn't contain. It would give Bryce time to do the same, time to reach whatever attorneys he still had answering his calls, time to construct whatever version of events might let him salvage something out of a plan that had just come apart in front of half the town. I had expected this. I'd expected, in fact, that this was exactly the move a cornered man behind that bench would try to make, one last attempt to look like he still held the authority he'd been leaning on since the moment I'd walked into that chamber that morning. I wasn't going to let him have it. "Councilman," I said, and I kept my voice as level as it had been every other time I'd spoken that morning. "Before you call the recess, there's one more matter I'd like this committee to be aware of." I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone, setting it on the table in front of me, screen facing up. Ruth glanced at me, a small, understanding nod passing between us, and she rose to ask the room's technician to route the display to the large screen mounted above the bench, the one the committee normally used for zoning maps and site photographs. It took a moment for the cable to connect, an oddly ordinary delay in the middle of a morning that had stopped feeling ordinary a long time before. Nobody in that chamber spoke while we waited. I could hear the ventilation system again, that same low hum from earlier, and somewhere behind me a chair creaked as someone shifted their weight, unwilling to look away in case they missed whatever was coming next. The screen flickered to life. What appeared on it was a confirmation notice, time-stamped official, sent that same morning at 8 o'clock from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Regional Field Office, along with a parallel notice from the state's Federal Ethics Oversight Committee. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters to how this story gets told. I hadn't set a trap for Councilman Doyle to walk into blindly that morning. I hadn't known with certainty exactly how the hearing would unfold when I woke up and pinned that medallion to my lapel. I had only known, from the tone of the filings from a handful of quiet conversations with Ruth over the preceding weeks, that something about this case felt engineered to be more theatrical than a simple property dispute ever needed to be. And I had learned a long time ago across 46 years of watching buildings and the people who wanted to tear them down for a better return, that when you sense a fight coming, you prepare for it before it arrives, not after it's already standing in front of you. I let the silence sit for a moment before I spoke again. I've known about the arrangement between my son-in-law's company and Councilman Doyle's office for approximately 4 weeks now, I said. The falsified bid documents and the financial records tracing payments between the two of them were submitted to federal investigators this morning at 8 o'clock, before this hearing even began. Everything said in this chamber today, every single word of it, has simply become the final piece of evidence needed to complete that file. The room didn't gasp this time. It went past that, into something closer to a held breath, a silence so complete I could hear the small mechanical whir of the projector fan above the screen. I watched Councilman Doyle's face change in a way I hadn't seen from him yet that morning, the arrogance and the irritation both draining out of it at once, replaced by something closer to genuine fear, the look of a man realizing all at once that the version of this morning he'd imagined controlling had never actually been his to control at all, not from the very first moment he'd told me to remove my medallion. He reached for his gavel and set it down again without striking it, his hand not quite steady. "This is," he started, and then stopped, apparently unable to find a sentence large enough to fit what had just happened to him in front of everyone he was supposed to be governing. Beside the petitioner's table, Bryce had gone entirely white. I watched him pull his own phone from his jacket, hands fumbling slightly, and dial someone, pressing it to his ear with a kind of desperate urgency I had never once seen from him at any family dinner, no matter how heated our disagreements had become over the years. Nobody answered, apparently, because after several long seconds he lowered the phone, staring at the screen as though it had personally betrayed him. He tried again. Same result. I understood, watching him, that whatever legal counsel he had once believed was firmly in his corner had already begun quietly distancing themselves from a client who was about to become a significant liability to their firm's own name. His attorneys were no better off. I watched the two of them lean toward each other, whispering in low, urgent tones, one of them already gathering papers into his briefcase with the particular haste of a man calculating how quickly he could get his firm's name off this case entirely before the morning's transcript reached anyone who mattered. The gavel Councilman Doyle had been holding slipped from his fingers and struck the bench with a small, hollow sound that seemed, in that silence, far louder than it had any right to be. He didn't reach to pick it back up right away. He sat there, staring at the screen above him, at the phrase Federal Bureau of Investigation still glowing in plain black text. And I watched something in him finally break loose entirely, the last thread of composure he'd been holding on to since the moment I'd walked up to his bench with that blue folder nearly half an hour earlier. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen. I want to be clear about that. I had not spent the past 4 weeks building this case because I wanted to see two men humiliated in a public chamber. I had built it because I understood the moment I read the language of Bryce's petition that whatever was happening to Oakwood was never really about Oakwood at all. It was about a system quietly bent to serve two men's ambitions, at the expense of everyone who trusted that system, to be honest, and I'd decided somewhere in those 4 weeks that I would rather spend what remained of my strength protecting that trust than protecting my own comfort. Councilman Doyle finally stood unsteadily and gestured to the bailiff near the side door. "This committee," he said, his voice barely carrying now, nothing like the sharp authority it had held an hour earlier, "will take a recess." Nobody in that chamber moved to stop him as he walked, a little too quickly, through the side door and out of sight, leaving his gavel resting where it had fallen. I sat back down slowly, feeling something loosen in my own shoulders that I hadn't realized had been wound so tight all morning. And for the first time since I'd walked into that building, I let myself glance over at Bryce, who wouldn't meet my eyes at all, and then further back at Nora, who was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking in a way that told me the grief she was carrying had very little left to do with the fate of a building and everything to do with the marriage she now understood, with total and devastating clarity, had never been what she believed it was. Around us, the gallery had begun to stir, that low, restless hum of a crowd trying to process something too large to sum up in a single sentence to the stranger sitting beside them. I stayed where I was, hands folded on the table, and let the room have its moment, the same way I'd let it have every other moment that morning. There would be time later for reckonings of a quieter, more private kind. For now, I simply sat and let the weight of everything that had just happened settle over the chamber exactly as it needed to. 4 months passed before the full weight of that morning finished landing on everyone it was going to land on. I've learned over a long life that consequences rarely arrive all at once. They come in waves, spaced out, each one carrying a little more of the truth than the last, until the people who caused them finally understand the whole shape of what they built. The federal investigation moved faster than I expected. Once it had the documentation, Ruth and I had spent weeks quietly assembling. Councilman Everett Doyle was formally removed from the City Planning Committee within 6 weeks, stripped of his position after an ethics review confirmed what Dr. Halsey's testimony had already made clear to everyone sitting in that chamber, that he had accepted undisclosed payments from Bryce's development company in exchange for expediting the emergency suspension of my ownership rights. Payments routed through a shell consulting firm that hadn't fooled the federal auditors for more than a few days. He was indicted on charges of bribery and official misconduct 3 months after that hearing. I heard secondhand that he pleaded guilty rather than face trial, and that he was sentenced to 18 months, though by then I had mostly stopped following the details. There's only so much satisfaction a man my age has any real use for, and I'd already gotten what actually mattered to me, which was Oakwood, still standing, exactly where Constance had built it. Bryce's fall took longer, and it was, in its own way, more thorough. His development company collapsed within weeks of the story becoming public, investors pulling out overnight once the fraudulent inspection report made local news, then regional news, then briefly national news. The kind of story people can't help sharing because it has a villain simple enough to hate and a victim sympathetic enough to root for. He was charged with commercial fraud and forgery of official documents, the same charges that had briefly threatened Councilman Doyle. And unlike Doyle, Bryce chose to fight the case in court, a decision his own attorneys reportedly advised against. He lost. The judge in that trial, I was told, specifically cited the fabricated inspection report as an aggravating factor in sentencing. A man who hadn't simply wanted a piece of land, but had been willing to manufacture false, federal-adjacent evidence and drag an elderly man's ownership rights through a public hearing to get it. I didn't attend that sentencing. Nora did alone, and told me about it afterward over coffee at my kitchen table, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been in the months right after the hearing. That conversation, more than anything else that happened in the weeks after Oakwood was finally safe, is the one I think about most. She came to see me on a quiet Sunday afternoon, several weeks after the divorce papers had been filed, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd once received the summons that started all of this. Her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she never quite got around to drinking. She apologized not just for the lawsuit, not just for the months of family dinners where she'd gone quiet instead of standing beside me, but for something larger and harder to name, for the slow way she'd let herself stop asking questions she should have kept asking, for mistaking her own exhaustion for evidence that Bryce might have been right after all. I should have seen it, she said. I did see parts of it. I just kept telling myself I was imagining things because it was easier than believing my own husband could do something like that to my father. I told her what I've come to believe is the truest thing I know after everything I've spent my life building and repairing. You can't always stop someone you love from making a mistake. Sometimes you can't even stop them from making a mistake that costs you something precious. But you can decide, once the dust has settled, how you choose to respond to the person left standing in front of you, and whether you let that mistake become the only thing that defines the years you still have left together. She cried harder at that than she had at any point during the hearing itself, and I got up from my chair and held her the way I used to when she was small enough to carry, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, because there wasn't anything left that needed saying. I never once told her I blamed her. I don't think I ever did blame her, not really. Not once I understood how carefully and patiently she'd been worn down over years by someone who had made an art of exactly that kind of erosion. Love, I've found, is a good deal more generous than most people give it credit for being, especially when it comes to forgiving the people we love for being human in front of someone determined to exploit that humanity. She's rebuilding now, slowly, the way people do after something like that. She comes by Oakwood on Tuesday afternoon sometimes to help with the reading circle her mother started 30 years ago, the same one that never once stopped meeting, not even during the worst of the hearing, not even during the months the divorce dragged through the courts. I think, in a strange way, that building has become as much a part of her healing as it ever was a part of Constance's legacy. And there's something in that I find I can't quite put into words, except to say that it feels like the kind of thing Constance herself would have wanted, if she'd been given any say in how all of this eventually turned out. I was in the workshop at Oakwood on a Thursday evening in early autumn when I finally let myself feel, all the way through, that this particular chapter had closed. The light was doing that low gold thing it does in October, slanting in through the tall windows Constance had insisted on installing decades ago because she said children read better with real sunlight on the page. I had a group of 6 kids gathered around the old workbench, teaching them how to plane a strip of pine, down smooth and even, the same lesson my own father had once taught me in a workshop half this size in a town 3 states away, more than 60 years ago now. You don't force it, I told them, guiding a small hand along the plane's worn handle. You feel for where the wood wants to give, and you let it. Same as most things worth doing right. One of the kids, a girl of maybe 9 with sawdust already dusted across her sleeve, asked me why I still came in every week to teach them this, when I could just as easily be at home, retired, doing whatever it is old men are supposed to do with their time. I told her the truth. I told her this building had been the last real thing my late wife ever built, and that the best way I knew to keep something like that standing wasn't just fixing its walls when they needed fixing. It was making sure it kept doing exactly what it was built to do, for as long as I had hands steady enough to help it along. When the lesson ended, and the children filed out into the early evening, I stood alone for a while in the reading room, looking out through those tall windows at Oakwood's front lawn, the old brick catching the last of the sunset in a warm, unhurried gold. I reached up, almost without thinking about it, and touched the small medallion still pinned to my jacket, the hammer and compass worn soft under my fingers, the same one a man behind a bench had once told me to put away because he thought it wouldn't buy me any sympathy in his courtroom. He was wrong about that, though not in the way he meant. I never needed it to buy me sympathy. I only ever needed it to remind me of something I already knew, standing in that workshop, in that library, in every building I ever helped keep standing across 46 years of quiet work. Most people never saw and never thought to ask about. The strongest things in this world are rarely the loudest. They sit underground in the foundation, doing their work without complaint, without applause, without ever needing anyone's permission to matter. Men like Bryce and Everett Doyle spend their whole lives building on lies and leverage, convinced that power is the same thing as solid ground. And they are always, eventually, proven wrong, because a foundation built on deception rots from the inside, whether anyone is watching or not. Conscience and honor were never meant to be loud. They were meant to hold, quietly, under whatever weight eventually gets placed on top of them, long after everyone who doubted them has gone looking for someplace else to stand.